the 1894 Kentucky disappearance that ended a bloodline forever in the Appalachians. Imagine a quiet autumn evening in the deep fold of a Kentucky hollow, where the crickets suddenly fall silent and the mist clings to the ridges like a burial shroud. You are looking at a family, the Lawsons, who were once the heartbeat of a thriving homestead, until the morning they simply ceased to exist. They did not move away, they did not pack their trunks, and they left their livestock pacing in the fields. They vanished into a landscape that has swallowed many, but none so completely as these children. Before we step into the shadows of this mountain tragedy, make sure you are subscribed to Lives in Rupture, where we peel back the layers of history that the hills try to keep buried. You might want to pull your chair closer to the fire, because once you hear the details of what happened in October 1894, you will understand why the local folks stopped mentioning the Lawson name entirely. What could drive a family to leave their plates half-eaten and their doors swinging wide into the biting wind? And more importantly, why were their footprints found leading toward the crest of the ridge, only to vanish into nothingness, as if the air itself had opened up and pulled them through? The year 1894 was a time of harsh transition in the Appalachian backcountry. The mountain folk were bound by the seasons and the narrow, winding trails that snaked through the Cumberland Plateau. Elias Lawson and his wife Sarah were respected members of their small community near the border of Virginia. They were not wealthy, but they were industrious. Their children, the bright-eyed Thomas, the eldest daughter Clara, and the youngest, little Samuel, were the pride of the homestead. The family lived in a cabin perched on a steep slope, shielded by ancient oaks that flickered with golden leaves as winter approached. Life was defined by the cycles of the harvest. By mid-October, the corn had been shucked, the woodpile was stacked high, and the cellar was stocked with preserves. There was no indication of trouble, no whispers of illness, and no debts that would necessitate a flight into the wilderness. Yet, on a Tuesday morning characterized by a heavy gray fog that refused to lift, the silence that settled over the Lawson cabin became permanent. When the neighbor, a man named Silas Thorne, climbed the rocky path to trade for tobacco, he found the front door latch dangling loose. The hearth was cold, the ashes long since turned to gray dust. The table was set for breakfast, but the porridge had hardened into a crusty, inedible mass. The most unsettling sight was not the emptiness of the rooms, but the state of the children's room. Their heavy wool blankets were still tossed aside as if they had climbed out of bed in a hurry, perhaps interrupted by something that demanded their immediate attention. Silas searched the immediate perimeter, calling their names until his voice turned raspy, but the only response was the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling high above the canopy. He did not go deep into the woods alone. In those days, the woods were not just nature. They were a labyrinthine territory that could hide a man for a lifetime. He returned to the valley floor, his face pale, to sound the alarm. Within hours, the community of men gathered with lanterns and rusted rifles, their breath misting in the cold air as they prepared to comb the ridges. The search party followed a faint trail that led away from the cabin. It was not a path a family would take if they were relocating. It was a jagged, erratic route that seemed to favor the thickest underbrush. They found the first clue near the creek bed, a small leather boot belonging to Samuel. It was soaked through, yet the leather remained remarkably soft, as if it had been pulled off only moments before they reached it. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, the men found the other children's tracks. They were clear in the damp mud, pointing toward the notorious Devil's Dip, a deep, limestone-heavy ravine known for its treacherous drops and sudden, unnatural shifts in temperature. The footprints did not show signs of panic. They showed a steady, purposeful walk side by side, as if they were being led by a hand they knew and trusted. Then, at the very edge of the limestone ledge, the tracks stopped. There were no slips, no signs of a struggle, and no remnants of footprints leading back. It was as if the children had stepped off the edge of the world. History often forgets the people who live in the margins, and the disappearance of the Lawson family was no exception. Official records from the county clerk are sparse, offering only a brief mention of a family missing and the eventual abandonment of their property. But history is also held in the oral traditions of the mountains, where the stories are passed down through generations. According to the elders, the Lawson family had been warned about the land they claimed. They had built upon a patch of earth that was considered off-limits for generations, a place where the mountain spirits were said to demand a tax. While the modern ear might dismiss this as superstition, The tragedy of 1894 provides a cold, hard anchor for the legend. Why would a mother leave her children's favorite doll behind? Why would a father leave his tools behind? These objects were not merely possessions. They were extensions of their existence. Their abandonment suggests an event so sudden and so overwhelming that common sense was stripped away in an instant. There is a theory often whispered in the taverns of the nearby counties that the Lawsons did not wander away, but were instead caught in an intersection of historical circumstances. Some suggest that they were caught in the crossfire of one of the many localized blood feuds that plagued the region in the late 19th century. However, the evidence lacks the violence typically associated with such disputes. There were no bullet casings, no scorched earth, and no blood. If they were taken with a chillingly silent efficiency. Others point toward the geography itself. Deep in the Appalachian folds, there are pockets of limestone caverns that remain unmapped to this day. These natural sinkholes can open up without warning, particularly after a season of heavy rain. But a sinkhole would have left debris, a collapse of earth, a clear path of destruction. Instead, the ground at the Devil's Dip was as undisturbed as an altar. As the weeks turned into months, the search transitioned from a desperate rescue mission into a somber, haunting memory. Elias and Sarah were never found, and the house began to groan under the weight of the forest. The roof eventually bowed inward, the walls surrendered to the rot of the damp mountain air, and the forest reclaimed the clearing. The story of the Lawson family became a cautionary tale told to children who dared to stray too far from the porch light. "Do not go near the Devil's Dip," they would whisper, "for the mountain remembers what it takes." It is a haunting thought, is it not? That a family, a unit of people with names, dreams, and a future, could simply be erased from the census books, vanished into the mist of a Kentucky autumn. The lack of resolution is what burns the mind, the inability to say with certainty what became of those 3 children and their parents. What we do know is that the bloodline ended there. There were no cousins waiting to claim the land, no distant relatives to hold a memorial, and no tombstones to mark their passing. The Lawson name became a ghost, an echo in the valley that only surfaces when the wind howls through the hollow in a specific mournful pitch. We look at the records and we see a void, a blank space in the ledger of time. We try to overlay modern logic onto a landscape that operated by older, darker rules, but the pieces never quite fit. Could there have been a traveler, someone passing through the mountains who lured them away? Or is it possible that the secrets of the mountains are not meant for us to uncover, but merely to witness from a distance? In the quiet of our own lives, we assume that we have agency over our end. We assume that our stories will have a conclusion, a final chapter that provides answers. But the Lawsons remind us that history is often incomplete, and that the wilderness holds a power that defies explanation. The disappearance of the Lawson family serves as a stark reminder of how fragile our connection to this earth really is. They walked out of their cabin, they walked into the fog, and they stepped into a silence that has never been broken. The mystery is not just about where they went, but about why they left so much behind. It is the weight of those abandoned lives, the half-eaten breakfast, the discarded boots, the silent home, that anchors this story in our collective consciousness. As we look back at the 1894 disappearance, we must respect the darkness that surrounds the facts. We cannot force a solution where none exists, and we cannot demand justice from a tragedy that has already faded into myth. Instead, we carry the memory of the Lawsons as a testament to the unpredictable nature of our history. The Appalachian Mountains are not just beautiful landscapes. They are monuments to the lost, the forgotten, and the unexplained. Every ridge holds a story, and every hollow guards a secret. The Lawson family is now part of that landscape, woven into the roots of the trees and the steady flow of the creek. Their absence is a presence that continues to challenge our understanding of the world, a reminder that some doors, once closed by the hand of fate, are never meant to be opened again. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Lawson story is the mundanity of the events leading up to the end. They were living, working, and breathing just as we are, and then they were not. There was no grand catastrophe announced by the heavens, no public tragedy that shook the nation. There was only the slow, quiet realization by a neighbor that the world had become smaller, emptier, and colder. It is a slow-burn horror that respects the intelligence of the observer. You can see them, can you not? You can see the steam rising from the coffee, the children adjusting their coats against the chill, the father checking the latch one last time. And then, the screen fades to black. If you find yourself wandering the trails of Kentucky or listening to the wind in the hollows of Virginia, take a moment to consider the silence. It is not empty. It is full of stories that have been lost to time. The truth of the Lawson disappearance may never be unearthed, buried under a century of mountain soil and folklore, but it remains a pillar of the macabre history of the Appalachians. We honor those who were lost by acknowledging their story, by keeping the mystery alive, and by understanding that some secrets are best left in the care of the mountains. Thank you for joining me in this descent into the shadows. If this story has unsettled you, if it has made you look at the woods with a deeper sense of caution, then my work here is done. Make sure to reflect on these mysteries, for they are the threads that connect us to the darker, more enigmatic parts of our shared human history. As we come to the end of this account, remember that the story of the Lawson family is not a finished book. It is an open wound in the history of the Kentucky hills. Their disappearance continues to invite speculation, research, and a deep abiding curiosity in those of us who seek to understand the unexplainable. What would you do if you found yourself standing at the edge of that same ridge, peering into the abyss that swallowed a family whole? Would you search for the truth, or would you turn back, fearing what the Appalachian shadows might take from you? I leave you with that question, and with the heavy silence of the Kentucky woods. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark corners of the past, show your support for Lives in Rupture by sharing this video with those who appreciate a story that lingers long after the screen goes dark. There are more secrets in the mountains waiting to be told, and I intend to bring them to light no matter how deep they are buried. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and until the next time we meet by the fire, watch the shadows closely. The mountains have a long memory, and they are not done speaking yet. The shadows, however, do not merely stretch across the hills of Kentucky. They bleed into the neighboring valleys, weaving a tapestry of unease that spans the entire Appalachian chain. To understand the Lawson tragedy is to scratch the surface of a much broader, more ancient phenomenon. When we talk about the secrets of these mountains, we are talking about a region that has served as a crucible for the strange, the unexplained, and the categorically impossible. There is a specific quality to the air in these highlands, a density that seems to swallow sound and stifle light, as if the land itself were a living, breathing entity with a temperament that shifts between indifference and malice. It is this temperament that has birthed a century of whispered accounts of travelers who wandered into the brush and emerged fundamentally altered, or did not emerge at all. Consider for a moment the geography of isolation. The topography of the Appalachians is not like the open plains or the sweeping deserts. It is a claustrophobic geometry of ridges, hollows, and subterranean labyrinths. It is a landscape that demands a particular kind of submission from those who inhabit it. To live here is to accept that you are living on the skin of something far larger and much older than the civilizations that have attempted to carve homesteads into the slate and sandstone. Those who moved into the gaps and the coves during the settlement eras understood this intuitively. They practiced a form of mountain stoicism that bordered on the superstitious, passing down warnings about where not to step, when not to whistle, and which trees were best left unlooked at as the sun dipped behind the western peaks. This is not merely local folklore designed to scare children into staying close to the hearth. When you look at the distribution of unexplained disappearances across the state lines of Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, you start to see patterns that defy standard search and rescue logic. You see clusters of incidents that occur in areas with no discernible path, places where the terrain is so vertical and unforgiving that it seems impossible for a human being, let alone an entire family or a group of hikers, to have traversed it with enough speed to vanish without a trace. Yet the reports remain consistent. There is a frequent mention of a sensory shift before the event occurs, a sudden, absolute drop in the ambient noise of the woods. The cicadas stop their rhythmic droning, the birds fall silent, and the wind itself seems to hold its breath. It is a biological signal of a predator, yet there is rarely an animal to be found. Beyond the localized accounts of the Lawson case, there exists a darker, more persistent strain of Appalachian history that involves the very infrastructure of the earth. We are talking about the vast, unmapped network of cave systems that lace the belly of these mountains. Some of these caverns have been explored and documented, but the overwhelming majority remain nameless, sealed by rockfalls or hidden behind thick curtains of rhododendron. There are geologists who whisper about the acoustic properties of these limestone labyrinths, how the subterranean channels can carry sound for miles, distorting it, amplifying it, and making it seem as though a voice is coming from right behind your ear when the speaker is actually 2 canyons away. Is it possible that the stories of phantom figures, of voices calling from the deep, are simply the result of this acoustic trickery? Or is that a comfortable dismissal designed to paper over a reality that is far more unsettling? I have spent months poring over archives, digitizing brittle news clippings from the early 20th century, and interviewing the descendants of those who lived through the era of the Great Vanishings. One recurring motif in these accounts is the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by the forest itself. There is a profound sense of surveillance that permeates the accounts of those who have ventured too deep into the backcountry. It is as if the mountains have a sensory apparatus of their own, one that registers human presence like a foreign body. When a person stays too long or wanders too far from the safety of the known trails, the forest begins to correct the imbalance. It closes ranks. The paths that were there yesterday vanish, replaced by dense thickets that seem to have grown overnight. If we look at the psychological toll the mountains take on their inhabitants, we find another layer of the mystery. The isolation afforded by the hollows has always bred a unique insular culture, but it has also fostered a certain psychological vulnerability. Many of the families who were pulled into these vortexes of tragedy were already living on the edge of social and economic collapse, struggling against a land that was notoriously resistant to conventional farming or extraction. It creates a vacuum of hope, a space where the rational mind begins to fray. But to dismiss these disappearances as mere products of grief or collective psychosis is to ignore the physical evidence left behind. We are talking about abandoned shoes, gear laid out in perfect order, and in some truly baffling cases, items that simply should not be where they were found. Personal belongings appearing on high, inaccessible ledges, clothing folded as if waiting for a master who never returned. These are not the hallmarks of a random accident. They are the hallmarks of a process that is deliberate, ritualistic, and utterly indifferent to the human lives it consumes. Consider the case of the Blue Ridge disappearances in the late 1950s, where a party of surveyors went into the high country and emerged 3 days later with absolutely no memory of the middle 48 hours of their lives. When they were found, they were miles from their supposed route, standing in a circle in a clearing that contained no wildlife, no insects, and, according to their subsequent psychological evaluations, no sense of time. They described a sensation of heavy, pressurized air, like being at the bottom of the ocean, and a visual distortion where the trees seemed to melt and reconfigure themselves into shapes that were uncomfortably geometric. When these accounts are examined alongside the Lawson tragedy, the picture shifts from a series of isolated sad events to the suggestion of a regional anomaly, a geographic fault line that isn't just geological, but ontological. The mountains are not just rocks and trees. They are a repository of every secret, every buried sin, and every unresolved trauma that has been committed on their slopes since the dawn of time. There is a theory, debated in the quiet corners of fringe research, that certain areas of the world act as energetic batteries, storing the emotional frequency of the tragedies they have hosted. If that is true, then Appalachia is perhaps the most charged landscape on the planet. It is a place where the barrier between what is physical and what is ephemeral is dangerously thin. When the fog rolls down into the valleys in the early morning, turning the ridges into ghost ships sailing on a sea of gray, you can feel that thinness. You can feel the weight of 1,000 years of watching, waiting and waiting for someone to get lost just long enough to be kept. But why these families? Why the ones who seem to be trying to build a life against the odds? Perhaps it is because they are already moving through the woods with a certain fragility, a desperation that makes them easier for the mountain to pull into its orbit. Or perhaps it is entirely random, a quirk of physics that occasionally snaps a thread in the reality of the ridge. The truth, however, is likely much more cold. The mountain does not care about your intentions. It does not care about your family, your history, or your need to understand. It is a machine of earth and shadow, and it functions with a cold, mechanical precision that we have only begun to fathom. As I sit here looking at the maps I've pinned to my wall, connecting the dots of these vanishings with red string, I am struck by the geometry of it all. The lines form a pattern that looks almost like a web, centered on the most remote, untouched sections of the national forests. It is as if there is a predator that has staked out a territory, and we are merely the cattle wandering into its field. We tell ourselves that we are the masters of the earth, that we have paved over every mystery with asphalt and satellite coverage, Yet there are still these vast, dark gaps in our knowledge. There are still places where the GPS fails, where the compass spins, and where the silence becomes so loud it makes your ears ache. Many of you will ask me if I am afraid to go back, if I am afraid to walk these trails again, knowing what I know. The answer is not simple. Fear is a rational response to a threat, but this is something beyond fear. It is a pull, a magnetic fascination with the unknown that overrides the basic survival instinct. We are inherently drawn to the places that threaten us because we are desperate for the truth, even if that truth is that we are not the protagonists of this world, but merely guests who have outstayed their welcome. The mountains have been here long before us, and they will be here long after the last of our kind has faded into the dust of our own hubris. When you go into the woods, do not go with the arrogance of the explorer. Go with the humility of a visitor walking through a graveyard. Pay attention to the shifts in the light, the subtle changes in the wind, and the way the birds react to your presence. If you find yourself in a place where the air feels too dense, where the trees look too tall and the silence feels too heavy, turn around. Do not look for an explanation. Do not try to solve the riddle. Just leave, because there are things in these hills that do not want to be found, and there are histories that were never meant to be unearthed. The mountains are holding on to their secrets with a grip that has tightened over centuries, and they are not interested in letting go. As we conclude this chapter of our investigation, I want you to remember that the story of the Lawson family is not a closed book. It is a mirror. It forces us to confront the reality that we are surrounded by mysteries that defy every tool of science we have built. It challenges our perception of what is real and what is just a nightmare we have collectively hallucinated. And as I continue my work, digging through the archives and walking the forgotten trails, I will keep looking for the pieces that don't fit. I will keep chasing the shadows, even when they start to chase me back. But for now, I urge you to look at the world around you with a renewed sense of caution. The next time you find yourself at the edge of a forest, listen to the trees. Hear what they are telling you in the rustle of their leaves. They are speaking a language that goes back to the beginning of time, a language of decay, of growth, and of the quiet, inevitable consumption of all things. The mountains are watching, they are remembering, and they are waiting to see who will be the next to cross the threshold into the dark. Until we meet again, keep your eyes on the horizon, keep your ears open to the wind, and whatever you do, never stray too far from the path. You never know when the mountain might decide that you belong to it. The shadows are long, the history is deep, and the end of the story is never as far away as you think. Stay vigilant, stay grounded, and remember that some things are better left in the dark, buried deep beneath the roots of the trees where they cannot reach us. But we will keep digging anyway, because the truth, no matter how cold or how terrifying, is the only thing that belongs to us. Keep the campfire burning and watch the edge of the clearing. The night is not as empty as it seems. There's a lingering question that follows me like a phantom limb, an ache in the joints of my sanity that pulses whenever I close my eyes. If the mountains are indeed sentient, if they operate on a temporal scale that dwarfs our frantic, flickering lifetimes, then what are we to them? To us, the Lawson tragedy is a haunting narrative, a cautionary tale inscribed in the ledgers of local lore. To the peaks, to the limestone veins and the subterranean aquifers, it is likely nothing more than a dust mote landing on a stone, a brief vibration of air that passes before the mountain even draws a geologic breath. This is the cruelty of our condition. We search for meaning in the silence of the earth, desperate to believe that our suffering leaves a mark, while the wilderness continues its slow, indifferent conquest of all we have ever built. Consider the layout of the old homestead, the foundation that still sits beneath a tangle of wild briar and chokecherry bushes. Every surveyor who has attempted to map that plot reports the same anomaly. The magnetic north shifts when you cross the threshold of the collapsed cellar door. Compasses spin with a frantic, stuttering energy, as if the very poles of the earth are confused by the proximity of whatever lies beneath that heavy, rotted wood. It is not a malfunction of equipment. It is a manifestation of dissonance. There is a pocket there, a fold in the fabric of the landscape where the rules of physics seem to take a sabbatical, leaving behind a vacuum that hunger rushes in to fill. And yet, people still go there. They are drawn by the same morbid magnetism that brought the Lawsons to their ruin, a psychic gravity that pulls at the lonely, the curious, and the damned. I recall an interview I conducted 2 winters ago with a retired forestry ranger who spent 3 decades patrolling the northern perimeter of the range. He didn't talk about ghosts. He didn't talk about monsters or spectral manifestations. He talked about the sound of the wind, but not the way you might expect. He described it as a vocalization, a complex series of tonal frequencies that mimicked the rhythms of human speech without ever forming a coherent word. He claimed that if you sit in the silence long enough, the wind starts to weave names into your consciousness, names of people you haven't thought of in years, or names of people you have never met, but feel an inexplicable obligation to remember. When I asked him why he finally retired, his answer was simple. He woke up one morning to find his own name scratched into the frost on his cabin window from the outside, despite the fact that he was living 30 miles away from the nearest neighbor. He told me that the mountain had learned his identity, and once it knows you, it stops being a backdrop and starts becoming a participant. This brings us to the terrifying reality of the environment as an active observer. We tend to view the natural world as a stage, a static, silent platform upon which our dramas play out. We are the actors, and the trees are just the scenery. But what if the scenery is the protagonist and we are merely the invasive species, the fleeting irritants that crawl across the surface of a sleeping god? The history of the region is littered with disappearances that don't make the headlines, individuals who wandered into the thicket and simply ceased to be. The police reports are monotonous in their predictability. Signs of struggle absent, personal belongings left in neat piles, footprints that end abruptly in the middle of a clearing, as if the person had suddenly decided to ascend into the sky. We look for serial killers, for wild animals, for accidents, because those are the variables we can categorize. We cannot categorize a mountain that decides to swallow a traveler whole because it found their presence aesthetically displeasing, or perhaps just mildly amusing. The Lawson family was different only in the duration of their suffering. They were held, toyed with, and then dispersed. They didn't just vanish, they were undone. And while I have spent years trying to reconstruct their final days through the fragmented journals found in the wreckage of their farmhouse, I have come to realize that I am not reading a record of a tragedy. I am reading a transcript of a conversation between humanity and an intelligence that finds us utterly incomprehensible. The scribbles in the margins of Thomas Lawson's diary, those geometric shapes that look like half-formed constellations, are not nonsense. They are attempts to map a geometry that doesn't exist in our dimension. He was trying to draw the architecture of the trap. He knew, long before the walls began to bleed shadow, that the house was not sitting on the ground, but rather floating above a rupture in the veil. We have to consider the possibility that certain places have a memory, not a metaphorical memory, but a biological one. The soil, the ancient root systems of the hemlock and the pine, the mineral deposits that have sat undisturbed since the formation of the continent, they function like a neurological network. They retain the energy of every death, every moment of profound terror, every pulse of adrenaline that has ever bled into the earth. When you walk through those woods, you are walking through a graveyard of impressions. You are walking through the static of a billion echoes. That is why the air feels heavy, why the temperature drops without warning, why your hair stands on end. You are not being watched by a spirit. You are being processed by a sensory organ that encompasses the entire valley. My journey into this darkness has taken a toll that I fear is irreversible. There are nights when I dream of the mountain, not as a collection of rock and shale, but as a vast, shifting face, its features obscured by clouds, its eyes wide and vacant, staring down at my window. I wake up with the distinct sensation that I am being audited, as if my very existence is a debt that is finally coming due. I have started to notice that my own reflection in the mirror looks slightly different, a fraction of a second slower than my own movements, a delay that suggests something is beginning to fill the space between my intent and my actions. I tell myself it is the stress of the research, the isolation, the obsession, but I know better. I have crossed the threshold. I have looked into the maw of the mystery, and I have felt the mystery look back, but I cannot stop. Even if I wanted to, the momentum of the truth is too great. We are living in a temporary state of ignorance, a fragile bubble of safety that we construct around ourselves to keep the cold at bay. We convince ourselves that the world is ours, that we understand its mechanics, that we are the masters of our own destiny. But the Lawson file, and all the shadows that dance in its periphery, exists to remind us that we are guests at best and prey at worst. The mountain does not care about our laws, our logic, or our legacies. It cares only for the cycle, for the consumption of the transient, and for the preservation of its own vast, suffocating silence. If you find yourself reading these words in the quiet of the night, if you feel the sudden urge to look behind you, do not fight it. Acknowledge the instinct. It is the oldest part of you, the primal signal that has kept our species alive since we first crawled out of the caves and into the light of the fire. The darkness is not empty. It is crowded with the remnants of those who thought they were safe, those who thought they could outrun the inevitable reach of the landscape. And as I push forward, mapping these points of convergence, tracing the ley lines of the Lawson tragedy, I'm becoming more convinced that the end of this story is not in the archives, and it is not in the soil. It is in the recognition. It is in the moment you realize that the mountain is not an object to be studied, but a presence to be feared. There is a specific trail, marked by a stone cairn that looks unnaturally symmetrical, that leads to a ridge overlooking the old Lawson Valley. I intend to go there tonight, not because I'm looking for closure, but because I'm looking for an invitation. I want to see if the mountain recognizes the person who has spent so much time dissecting its secrets. I want to see if the silence will finally break, if the wind will finally articulate the name it has been whispering in the dark. It is a foolish endeavor, perhaps even a suicidal one, but one does not spend their life staring into the abyss without eventually wanting to see what lies at the bottom. If I do not return, if these reports cease, and my notes are left gathering dust on a forgotten desk, do not mourn the loss. Instead, understand that this was always the intended trajectory. The path leads to the clearing leads to the threshold, and the threshold leads to the dark. The Lawsons were not victims of a random accident. They were the first ones to truly understand the price of admission. They paid it, and now it seems, it is my turn to settle the ledger. Keep the fire bright, keep your doors locked, and for the love of all that is still illuminated, stay away from the deep woods when the sun begins to dip below the jagged teeth of the peaks. The mountain is hungry, the shadows are stretching, and the truth, no matter how cold, is waiting for you to walk into its embrace. We are all just stories being told in the dark, and eventually, the one who is telling the story decides that it is time for the chapter to end. I can hear the trees shifting now, rearranging themselves to block my way back. The wind is beginning to speak, and for the first time, I think I understand exactly what it is trying to say. I am not disappearing. I am simply returning to the geography. I am becoming part of the landscape that I once tried to document. Turn off the light. It only makes it easier for them to see you. The mountain is waiting, and finally, I am ready to meet it.